1 and 1. One of the oldest midrashim of the Jews, the Makilta, claims that the Septuagint translators, those who translated the Hebrew Masoretic text into the Septuagint Old Testament Greek text, they changed the meaning of the first verse. This is on page 63 of Brown. This is one of the passages, just one of the passages, they list 10 actually, which they changed when writing the Torah for King Ptolemy. Likewise, they wrote for him, God created in the beginning. They changed it with Elohim bara bereshit. This allegation against the Greek translation is also picked up by the Tanhuma B'Shemot at 1 and verse 19, which lists 10 such changes, including Genesis 1 and 1. Such a Hebrew retro version from the Torah for King Ptolemy would preclude the possibility of translating Genesis 1 and 1 as a dependent clause in the original Hebrew. In addition, early rabbinical texts unambiguously claim light is the first created substance. That's in the Bereshit Rabbah and the Shemot Rabbah and the Pirkei Rabbah Lezer. The last two favor the order of creation found in Psalm 104 verse 2 over the order of creation found in Genesis 1 through 3. So the proper historical context, starting with the very first verse of the Bible, is that we have a text that's been tampered with, just exactly like Joseph Smith understood it correctly also. This does nothing to refute Mormonism, folks. Not one thing. Now, before I get to Susan Ackerman, I found a bargain at the bargain store for $1. It's by Leonard Swidler, Biblical Affirmations of Woman. It's the Westminster Press, 1979. It's a pretty thick book. He goes through all of the various aspects of women in the Bible, and including the women deities. And I thought it was fascinating. On page 24, in Elephantine, this is the colony of the Jews that escaped the Babylonian destruction, 600 BC. They went down into Egypt, into Elephantine. He says on page 24, he says, in Elephantine Judaism, the goddess Anath was the consort of Yahweh. In other words, it was his wife. Page 25, under the title, The Hebrews Worship the Goddess, the Yahwists struggled for hundreds of years to suppress the worship of the goddess among the Hebrews. Although biblical texts give us only a glimpse of the pervasiveness of the goddess worship among all of the Hebrews, most by way of condemnations of it by Yahwist's prophets and the destruction of goddess images, etc., so on and so forth, by reforming Yahweh's kings, it's worth outlining this history briefly to gain some sense of the implacable fury vented by the Yahwists on the goddess worshippers. The religion of Israel was goddess worship. Some of the Yahwist historians later on suppressed that worship, but that was part of the original religion. Margaret Barker's huge on this subject also. On page 29, Swidler notes, after the return of the Jewish people to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity, the exile, the public worship of the goddess seems to have been successfully suppressed. So what we're reading in the Bible, when we read all this polemical arguments and distortions against the original early religion, what we have in the later Bible is not the original religion. It was suppressed. Did you know that? We're not reading the original account of what happened, how it happened, and by whom it happened in the Bible, because it's a distorted account. The original religion was suppressed. William G. Dever also notes this in his fantastic book, Did God Have a Wife? And he answers in the affirmative, folks. That's a 2005 book, brand new out. The Archaeology of Ancient Israel. The historical context is God with a wife. Period. That's the archaeological and historical context of our Bible. And finally, getting to Susan Ackerman's phenomenal study. This is in Women in the Hebrew Bible. It's by Routledge Press, 1999. Susan Ackerman, and the women need dough. The worship of the Queen of Heaven in 6th century Judah. She notes that on page 21, we have to take seriously the other contexts of Israel's neighbors, because Israel was intimately involved with those neighbors. And instead of just accepting the Bible's version because it is a polemical version, they had an agenda in rewriting the history of Israel's worship, and it was against the original religion. We have to put it all together in a complete whole. She says that is a proper methodology. Now, this is a solid biblical scholar also, saying that this methodology is the one we have to participate with. On page 22 of her study, she says, the women of early 6th century Judah, for example, devoted themselves to the worship of a goddess called the Queen of Heaven. This is Jeremiah 7, 16 through 20, and Jeremiah 44, 15 through 19, and then 25. The women are steadfast in their worship of the goddess, baking cakes in her image as offerings, according to Jeremiah 7:18 and 44:19, and pouring out libations and burning incense to her, Jeremiah 44:15 and 19. This is critical to understand, to realize it is the major religion of all the people of Judah. She notes on page 23 that one of the attractive aspects of this goddess worship was because, like the other, the Syrian goddesses and so on and so forth, she was involved with fertility. And that's a critical element. On page 24 she says, in Israel, it was the Deuteronomist historians who accused the people of worshiping the Asherah in Judges 2:13, chapter 10, verse 6, 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 4, chapter 12, verse 10, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 5 and 33, 2 Kings 23:13, so on and so forth. Now, on 25 she notes that lexicographers generally agree that the kawanim is the word used for the cakes baked for the Queen of Heaven. And the idea is this is a worshipful aspect of the goddess. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is because on 26 and 27 she says, I submit that the Queen of Heaven is a syncretistic deity whose characteristics incorporate aspects of both the West Semitic Astarte goddess and the East Semitic Ishtar goddess. This syncretism probably occurred early in Canaanite religious history, well before the 6th century. Certainly the people of Judah in Jeremiah 44:17 and Jeremiah himself in 44:21 described the cult as one practiced by past generations. On page 27, this is an important point she makes. This woman's cult did not prosper only in those spheres such as the home and the family where we might expect to find women's religion. To be sure, there is a strong domestic component to the cult, of course, but, and this is seen in Jeremiah 7:18, where the children gather the wood, the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. But if we are to take Jeremiah 44:17 and 21 seriously, then the kings and princes of Judah are also among those who worshipped the queen. And if the worship of the Queen of Heaven was a part of the religion of the monarchy, the queen cult may also have been at home in what was essentially the monarch's private chapel, the temple. And this is certainly suggested by Ezekiel 8, verse 14, where the women who participate in the related cult of wailing over the queen's deceased lover, Tammuz, they sit at the north gates of the temple's inner court. The presence of a temple dedicated to the Queen of Heaven in 5th century Egypt, a century after Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 44, berates the Judahites who had fled to Egypt for worshiping the Queen of Heaven. This is very suggestive. They did not cease their worship, they continued on. So Susan Ackerman has some profoundly interesting things, the biblical data about the Queen of Heaven,